Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of Pandemic Dialogues, Conversations in Civic Crisis. This is our new virtual seminar series to provide perspective on our current public health and civic crisis through conversations among our school's faculty and students, expert guests, and a wider community. I'm Paul Carice. I'm the director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State University. Part of the school's mission is to promote civic dialogue about pressing issues of our time. And each academic year, our speaker series, the Civic Discourse Project, extends these conversations and debates from our classrooms to a broader community. Arizona PBS records those speaker events and broadcasts them. You can visit our website to see the full archive of our previous lectures in the Civic Discourse Project. That's at scetl.asu.edu. We had to postpone our final two lecture events of the year, and so we developed the Pandemic Dialogues as a way to make sense of these extraordinary times and to sustain our community of liberal arts and civic education learning. We're offering the dialogues in two modes. What you're joining tonight, a series of live webinars, each discussing a great work or deeper perspective on pandemics and civic crisis. And the second mode is a podcast discussing Camus' novel, The Plague. More information on the Pandemic Dialogues, both forms, the webinars and the podcast, and more information on our school generally, again, is at our website, scetl.asu.edu. Our first two webinars discussed Thucydides and Boccaccio. And now, just to cheer everybody up, we have a session on American 19th century fiction and Edgar Allan Poe to discuss his story, The Masque of the Red Death, and particularly in relation to ideas of the common good. I'm delighted to welcome two panelists for our discussion this evening. Our guest, Paul Crumbly of the University of Utah, and from our own School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. Joining me once again as co-inquisitor of a guest is Catherine Zuckert. We'll have three parts to tonight's webinar: an opening presentation from Professor Crumbly, then in part two, questions for him from Catherine Zuckert and myself. And then in part three, this is where you come in, a Q&A session from the virtual community that's joining us. So we ask you to please type your questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom. Our colleague, Professor Luke Perez, will collect the questions, and then Catherine Zuckert and I will take turns in part three posing those questions to our guest. You can also use the hashtag Pandemic Dialogues on Twitter to participate in the discussion as well. So now to introduce our guest and my co-inquisitor. Our guest is Paul Crumbly, a past president of the Emily Dickinson International Society and a professor of English at Utah State University. His scholarship centers on Emily Dickinson, May Swenson, and Jack London. His book publications include Dickinson's Fascicles, A Spectrum of Possibilities, Winds of Will, Emily Dickinson and the Sovereignty of Democratic Thought, Body My House, The Work and Life of May Swenson, and Inflections of the Pen, Dash and Voice in Emily Dickinson. He's also guest edited special issues for two journals recently, of the journal ESQ, a journal of the American Renaissance, on the topic of Dickinson's environments, and the Emily Dickinson Journal, a guest issue on Dickinson and celebrity. Joining me to grill him is Catherine H. Zuckert, an American political philosopher and the Reeves-Drew Professor of Political Science Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame. She's also a visiting scholar each spring semester in our school. Among Catherine's many works of scholarship are three books: Natural Right and the American Imagination, Political Philosophy in Novel Form, Plato's Philosophers, The Coherence of the Dialogues, and most recently, her book, Machiavelli's Politics. She also has co-authored two books on the political philosophy of Leo Strauss with her husband, Michael Zuckert, who also is a visiting scholar each spring in our school. So Professor Crumbly, thank you so much for joining us, and we now look forward to your opening presentation on Edgar Allan Poe's 1842 story, The Masque of the Red Death.
Excuse me. I want to begin by thanking the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership for including me in these pandemic dialogues. I want in particular to thank Carol McNamara for recommending that I be included. It's a pleasure to be here and to have had a chance to think through what a work like the Poe tale has to say at this particular moment in history. The title for the talk is The Masque of the Red Death and the Common Good, with the subtitle, How Not to Shelter in Place. I want to begin by giving a little bit of historical background, and I'm going to walk us through the tale, hitting on some primary passages, and then I want to step back and look at the work in the broader cultural context. First thing to bear in mind is that in Poe's world, disease was an ever-present concern. Yellow fever had raged across the North American continent on numerous occasions in the 19th century. Tuberculosis was a constant threat that Poe knew intimately. His mother and his wife died of tuberculosis, and many in his immediate circle suffered also. But really caught his attention and led to this particular story was the cholera epidemic of 1832. Cholera had not previously appeared in America. The doctors were a little perplexed as to how to proceed. They didn't know what caused it. The pandemic was considered to have originated in India, and the reported mortality rates for those exhibiting symptoms was 50%. Public response to the disease tended to be to panic and flee urban centers. Poe at the time in 1832 was in Baltimore, where he witnessed the panic. We know that a good friend of his, Ebenezer Burling, would succumb to the contagion while in Richmond. It was originally published, the tale, as The Masque of the Red Death in 1842 in Graham's magazine. It was published there with the word mask as the face covering. And it wasn't until 1845 that he changed the title to include the word mask that now appears in the title. And I think that's worth bearing in mind as we begin a discussion of the tale, because that shifts the focus to the medieval masque and the Renaissance courtly masque that tended to symbolize the interpenetration of earth, heaven, and hell, and bring to the foreground, at least to some extent, the question of divine judgment, which plays a major role in this story. Now, to work through the story, I have 5 key questions related to the common good. The first is, should the most prosperous and wealthy seek refuge to escape death and perpetuate the species? For Prospero and his crew, the answer is yes. The first sentence tells us there is no cure. The Red Death had long devastated the country. The second sentence tells us how terrible the disease is. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. And then with this information, we're told that Prospero acts with deliberation. He only takes action after half of his dominion was depopulated. And then once he takes action with deliberation, he generously invites 1,000 of his friends to seek refuge with him in a castellated fortified abbey. So under these circumstances, I think it's reasonable to say that seeking shelter to perpetuate the species seems entirely acceptable. The second question, is survival the primary common good? For Prince Prospero, again, the answer is yes. In the first paragraph, Poe writes that the scarlet stains, especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. Then we're told the gates of the abbey are welded shut to prevent ingress or egress, thereby demanding total commitment. There's no going back. To reinforce the need for absolute commitment, the narrator declares, the external world can take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. On the basis of this information, think we can conclude survival is the most important common good, even if it requires the sacrifice of sympathy for the less fortunate. Survival, if that's primary, requires sacrifice and total commitment. The third question, how do we as a species define human life in order to justify the belief that survival is indeed the primary common good? For Prince Prospero and his court, life is most rewarding when dedicated to carefree indulgence in sensual pleasure. Those selected for survival are described as hale and light-hearted friends of Prince Prospero. Then we're told that Prospero provides them all the appliances of pleasure. And then in paragraph 5 of this 14-paragraph tale, the ball, which is the centerpiece, is described as a voluptuous scene. But it's here at this point in the story that Poe interrupts the narrative. In paragraph 7, the halfway point in the tale, Poe's narrator disrupts the narrative to inject the possibility that Prince Prospero is mad. There are some, the narrator tells us, who would have thought him mad, that his followers felt that he was not. Poe interjects a value judgment not held by those in the abbey. And he wants to shake up the reader and cause them to pause and rethink what's going on. In the very next sentence, we learn that the healthy revelers must hear and see and touch Prospero to be sure he was not mad. We have just been told that the revelers felt Prospero was not mad, and now learn that they actually touch him, suddenly making the metaphorical felt into literal touch that reinforces the revelers' entire dependence on the evidence of their senses, while inserting the possibility that Prospero is actually touched, meaning mad. It is almost as if Poe shakes the reader and says, think about this on your own. Think about this independently. Make some decisions and value judgments that are following the lead of the narrator. So he's creating a kind of distance between the reader and the narrator and the events being narrated. In the next paragraph, the narrator uses the word dreams 4 times to describe the revelers as creatures of Prospero's distorted imagination. And there's sort of a gag or a pun or a joke just beneath the surface here is Poe's way of saying they're all of one mind. I mean, there's a degree of conformity that is remarkable, but the idea that they're that committed. Poe then disrupts the narrative once more in the next paragraph, paragraph 8, stating that the great fate included not a little of that which might have excited disgust. And he goes on and describes the people participating in the masked ball as grotesque, almost as if they're taking on the outward appearance that degrades the humanity that they're there to preserve. So there's a kind of perverse dynamic at work that is characteristic of Poe, just as it's characteristic of Poe to mix the tragic and the comic. So it wouldn't be unusual to have a level of humor just beneath the surface here. So based on that information, we begin to conclude that Poe has shifted the focus from Prince Prospero and his crew to the narrator, who now questions the value of survival if it requires the sacrifice of sympathy and independent thought and produces a mockery of human life. The fourth question, how important is time in any assessment of the common good during a time or a period of isolation? Prospero's behavior and that of the revelers indicates that time is tremendously important and must be denied at all costs. Now, bear in mind that this is a period of quarantine. This is a period of sheltering in place. And that presumes an eventual return to normal life, and therefore must be viewed as a temporary disruption. For that reason, conduct during isolation may be approached as either an insignificant whiling away of time, a kind of time out of time, a timeless state, like a vacation or a holiday or a carousal, during which behavior is inconsequential. Or it could be viewed as a period of trial, during which virtue is tested and ultimately judged. Now, it's quite obvious that Prince Prospero and his followers have chosen the former. As a consequence, each passing second erodes the revelers' belief in the temporary nature of their isolation, translating revelry from an inconsequential diversion into a way of life incompatible with moral or spiritual accountability. To drive this point home, the narrative presents Prospero as proposing the masked ball at the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, at a time when the pestilence raged most ferociously abroad. In other words, it's not abating. They're going to be in here for, he doesn't know, nobody knows how much longer. And so he needs a distraction. And that's why he brings up the ball. At least that's one of the reasons he might be bringing up the ball. And it's immediately after being told that this amount of time has passed that the narrative then describes the 7 rooms marking the 7 stages of life. Significantly, these rooms are so irregularly disposed that vision embraced but little more than one at a time, symbolizing the need to hold time in abeyance. We then learn that the revelers, who are very disturbed by the chiming of the ebony clock, it shocks them. You know, they break their routine, everything halts, and they're clearly rattled. We learn that the revelers reinforce each other's denial of time by whispering vows to each other, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock would produce in them no similar emotion. So they work together to calm each other's nerves. This building, there's suspense, and we get like we're moving towards some kind of reckoning or climax. Poe then magnifies the rapidity of time's passage by describing each hour as the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies. Prospero, the end of the story then, is absolutely outraged by the appearance of the Red Death, who leads him through the 7 rooms and forces him to confront the reality of death and that he can't stay outside of time. So based on this last bit of information, because it's impossible to know for certain that sheltering in place or quarantine is temporary, survival alone cannot be the primary common good. So the last question, is it possible to suspend essential human values temporarily and then resume those values once survival is assured? According to Poe's narrative, and here you've only got the narrative at the end. You only got the narrator. We've sort of been slipping to the narrator's side of reading events anyway. Poe has encouraged us to do that. But this is made very clear by the narrator at the very end of the story. In the final paragraph, where the Red Death is described as arriving like a thief in the night, thus alluding to the Day of Judgment as described in the Bible. And I think one of the more appropriate passages comes from 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 2 and 3, where we find this highly relevant observation. For you yourselves know very well that the Lord will come like a thief in the night. When they say there is peace and security, then suddenly destruction will come upon them, and there shall be no escape. Based on this last piece of information, we can conclude humanity's inability to predict the moment of death means that fundamental moral values cannot be suspended while sheltering in place without the risk of damnation. So I'm offering now then 2 broad and related conclusions. Poe's tale implies that during times of contagion, sheltering in place serves the common good only when those in isolation retain the fundamental human values that include notably sympathy for the stricken, without which it is impossible to sustain respect for human life and maintain spiritual health. Conclusion number 2, Poe implies that it is particularly difficult for members of the upper classes to preserve their souls because even in normal times, they maintain a degree of isolation from the less fortunate that requires a withdrawal of sympathy. It is worth recalling that 1,000 members of Prince Prospero's court were hale and light-hearted friends who, like Prince Prospero, were happy and dauntless despite the fact that half the population had been decimated by the plague. Okay, now stepping back and wondering why Poe places the kind of stress I'm indicating he does on the role of sympathy. And I think he does this because sympathy was highly valued in 19th century America as a means of sustaining belief in the democratic experiment during a time of dramatic and often chaotic change. People needed to be assured that persons of other classes, races, nationalities, and ethnic traditions who often spoke different languages felt the same way. They needed to believe that other people felt as they did and could be trusted to use their voice in government to promote the common good. Sympathy was at the very heart of 19th century American sentimental culture and closely affiliated with the Second Great Awakening that viewed conversion as admitting Christ into one's heart and becoming born again into a community of spiritual equals. Christ, as the man of suffering who came to die so that we might live forever, was the embodiment of sympathy. Nowhere in the 19th century American literature was sympathy more fully on display than in Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the book that outsold every book in the world except the Bible and is considered the epitome of the sentimental novel. Stowe, who was the daughter of Lyman Beecher and sister of Henry Ward Beecher, two of the most famous ministers of the Second Great Awakening, had this to say in the final chapter of Uncle Tom's Cabin. There is one thing that every individual can do. They can see to it that they feel right. An atmosphere of sympathetic influence encircles every human being, and the man or woman who feels strongly, healthily, and justly on the interests of humanity is a constant benefactor to the human race. See then to your sympathies in this matter. Are they in harmony with the sympathies of Christ? Of course, she's talking about slavery and the evil of slavery and how sympathy can lead to the eradication of that evil. But I do think this is pretty much what Poe is saying in The Masque of the Red Death, only his subject is the common good during a plague while sheltering in place, not the evil of slavery. Both Poe and Stowe shared an eschatological vision that insisted life be lived as if death and final judgment were always immediately at hand. Okay, thank you. That's the end of my part of part one.
Thank you so much, Professor. That I'll use the banquet metaphor. That sets the table very nicely for questions. Apparently I may have misspoken early and introduced you as coming from the University of Utah. How could I do such a thing? Utah State University, I meant to say. I had it written in my script. And now a reminder to everybody with us this evening, especially to students in the school, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to type some questions for part 3 of our webinar. But now to part 2, and Catherine always seems to win the coin toss, so she gets the opening question to Professor Crumley.
said that I was muted. Am I muted?
No, we can hear you, Catherine.
Okay, okay. I think I'd like to pick up actually on the end of Professor Crumbly's remarks for the following reason, and so ask the following question. You connected the final line of the Red Death appearing like a thief in the night with Thessalonians. But I have to say that the Red Death doesn't appear to me to be very much like the Lord. It seems, if anything, the description of the rooms leading to the black velvet room with the fiery light sounds more like hell than it does like heaven. And Prospero attacks the Red Death and dies, and all of the revelers die after him as a result of the Red Death. So they appear to be condemned, but being condemned, at least to me, doesn't seem to be the same as being saved. And so I wonder about the Red Death as the vehicle or messenger of judgment. Particularly because I had noticed in the very extensive description of the 7 rooms leading to this dark black room that they begin in the east and they end in the west, so that this abbey is actually built the opposite way that a medieval church would be built. So I guess I'd like you to explain a little bit more how you get to the Christian interpretation of the end.
Well, no, that's a good question. I do think it hadn't occurred to me that the abbey is designed sort of as the opposite of a cathedral. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I don't think
in the east.
Yeah, I don't think that's I do think that Poe's spiritual beliefs tended not to be, to my way of thinking, Christian. I mean, the closest he comes is, I think, his 1848 essay, Eureka, where he lays out a kind of pseudo-scientific blend with spiritual components. That's a kind of almost a cosmology. But at the same time, I think that Poe was really drawn to the medieval church. I think he was really drawn to cathedrals in particular and the Gothic, because that preserved that sense of mystery and sort of dark forces and dark powers at play in the universe and in the experience of humanity. And it's interesting that he inverts the order. I've always thought of the sequence of rooms as moving from the east to west, from birth to death. And people have worked out how even those colors match up with that progress through the different stages of life. But I think that is interesting in terms of the cathedral interplay because of the biblical statement, from the New Testament, that you don't know when you die, when you're going to die, and as a person in concern for the welfare of the soul, it's important to be alert to that possibility at all times. And I think that's really what Poe was getting at here. And I also think, and I'd hope I'm not drifting away from your question too much by saying this, but Poe really did not like the deist's notion of watchmaker God, the Newtonian Enlightenment view. He was horrified in many ways that America had become way too materialistic and way too driven by reason. And so he liked that sense of mystery and wonder that's associated with the medieval church. And I'm thinking that he brought up, I'm working with the thief in the night approach because it's there in the story, and he wanted to bring it up for some reason. And I think if you think about Poe what does he write about? He writes about the death of beautiful women, you know, and that's at the center of his prose works. And that always involves death. And that reckoning that comes with death, confronting the self and recognizing the way that the self is an extension of something we really don't understand, that is forever mysterious to us, and that our mortality is something we cannot escape. And there's a sort of a sadness and loss that comes with that kind of recognition that I think for Poe almost functioned in a way that the Sublime did for artists, other artists and painters. It flooded the self with an overwhelming sense of feeling that led to a kind of humility and sense of participation in a much larger, mysterious universe. Is that getting there to the answer?
Yes, could I just ask a follow-up? Because I was surprised, but I don't know as much about the context as you told us, by your emphasis on sympathy. I mean, it seems to me clear, as clear as anything in the story is, and I'm not sure that ultimately it's clear, that we're being told that you can't escape death. And so this whole attempt to do so was fundamentally foolish, despite the narrator telling us that Prospero was sagacious at the beginning of the story.
Yeah.
But would then the extension be that these people were not sympathetic? That's a part of their trying to avoid the recognition that they're going to die. I mean, they're trying to divert themselves. If they had thought about death, then they would have been sympathetic, because this is the fate of all human beings. And so it's something that we have in common.
Oh, yes, I think so. And I think that's why I brought in the Harriet Beecher Stowe, because I think she says that so clearly there. And that Poe also, I mean, part of the text, if you think about it, as I said in that second conclusion, he comes down pretty hard on the upper classes or the aristocracy, because they depend on a degree of not having sympathy. That is, they distance themselves from others and in a sense prevent themselves from feeling a greater degree of sympathy. And that feeds into, I think, the side of Poe that's fundamentally democratic. He's famous for unreliable narrators. And I think one of the functions of his unreliable narrator is to cause the reader to think independently, which is to practice being a democratic citizen, making your own conclusions about the experience that you're part of. In this tale, it works a little differently, because the narrator is someone who gets us to go along with him and part ways with our tendency. I mean, it's weird. It's kind of funny. We're in sympathy in a way with Prince Prospero and the revelers. And then the narrator comes and says, no, you shouldn't feel sympathy for these people.
Could I ask a question about the perception of Poe as a Christian writer and thinker? Is he trying to use some way allegory here with not only the thief of the night phrase, but also you mentioned time that flies, which is it's not strictly from the Christian scriptures, but it's a Christian maxim, tempus fugit memento mori, time flies, remember death.
Yeah.
Bit of an adaptation of a Roman phrase, tempus fugit. So is he speaking both to non-Christians or post-Christian culture as well as to Christians? Is he trying to pull, as you said, a sort of a rationalistic, scientific, materialistic culture of the 19th century back toward Christianity? What is his approach here?
Well, my sense is that he's finding it convenient to use Christianity here. I don't think that he's deeply committed to Christianity, aside from his respect for the way that Christianity was practiced by medieval Christians. But it's a powerful tool to use at this moment in American history, to utilize that. You know, in American culture, the memento mori was particularly powerful, you know, at this time, because people believed they'd be reunited with loved ones in the next life. And holding that memory steadfast was really important. And they did really weird things like create jewelry out of human hair, so that they could take the hair of the departed and wear it actually on their bodies, so that they'd be reminded of that person continually, and living with death, in a sense, as part of their body, in order to not forget that person, in order to hold them foremost. There was a sense in which the living were more intimate with the dead than they were with the members of the family who were still alive. But that gets at this whole idea of living with that tempus fugit notion, and that judgment is perpetually at hand.
So even if he's not, say, a believing or Orthodox Christian in a way, he's critiquing sort of Unitarianism or more rationalistic kinds of Christianity, or even the beginning
definitely.
As you mentioned, deistic thought, which had been around for quite a while in America. He's positioning himself against that as a poet.
Yeah. I would say so. I mean, his poetry focuses on beauty, he says, and that the prose focuses on truth. So in this story, I think a truth, you know, you could read it an allegory that can be interpreted in a multitude of ways, but the truth there is that death is always at hand, and you should live life accordingly. And it's this poet, in the Norton edition of this story, it's referred to as a tone poem, which means that it would sort of shift it over into the realm of beauty. And beauty for Poe was always connected to, in poetry, to sound and to heightened emotional states. And I think that those moments, Catherine, you mentioned, you alluded to this in the question that you sent to me, that there are moments when the revelers hear the chiming of the clock and they're frozen. There's a sense that they're sort of awakened to their condition in a way, and those frozen moments, I think, in some ways foreshadow the thief in the night idea, that they're forced to sort of see who they are, stop what they're doing, and they're flooded with very unsettling emotions. And if this is a tone poem, I think it has to do with the emotions that are aroused at that moment, at those moments, and the way that the whole content and meaning of life is suddenly reevaluated, reconsidered, and people are thrown off their pins. But I do think, you know, from the point of view of Christianity, that Poe's seizing an intersection. You know, the way that the eschatological vision at the heart of sentimental culture intersects with his belief in the need. That's also eschatological, but not so Christian in orientation.
All right, Catherine, you get the final question to Paul.
Okay, this is hard because I have a great number, but let me ask the question this way. The last pandemic that dialogue we had concerned the beginning of Boccaccio's Decameron, and I have read a little bit that suggests that that's a possible source of the Masque of the Red Death. And there is a structural similarity in that you have a group of young people who leave a city afflicted by a plague and go off. But there the similarity ends, because in the Decameron, they go out in the countryside. There are fewer of them. They are fed and they go to a nice place. There is some plague there. But it seems to me, ironically in this context, that the Decameron is closer to a very well-known theme in American literature, which is the return to nature. So we go back to nature as what's good, and nature is the source of life. And Poe seems to have turned that almost around, and instead of going to nature, we go into an abbey and we move towards death. So I wondered what you thought of his choice or his turn away from nature, as far as I can see.
Well, again, I mean, the setting of the tale isn't America, clearly. It's got more of that medieval Europe feel to it, and so that's part of it. But I think part of what Poe is doing with the Decameron in the background, the Decameron is a representation of what Prospero and the revelers should have been doing. Ian Moulton, I think, if I've got this correct, says that the people in the Decameron who retreated for 2 weeks into the countryside come away with is that they glean what is noble and worthy in human life. So they didn't take advantage of this free space to indulge in debauchery or to indulge the senses. They took the alternative. If you're going to shelter in place, the alternative is to take stock of life, think carefully about what's most important, and bring that to the foreground of your life. And I think that's what Poe is saying these people should have done.
It's ironic because the 10 youths and the Decameron go out, and yes, they eat and drink, but they tell each other stories. And telling stories would seem to be particularly important for an author of stories. This enables me to sneak in a question that one of the listeners has asked, and Aaron Kushner, who's the postdoc here. His question is essentially, well, what should they have been doing sheltering in place? What should good citizens do, or what should the government have done that Prospero didn't do?
Well, one of the first things that they could have done that I think is consistent with this allegory is to think about what if this state that we inhabit now isn't temporary. I mean, in this country at this moment, I think we're starting to have some of these questions too. What if this isn't temporary? And if it's not temporary, then how do you make the best of it? And you can then face that choice. Should I, immerse myself in diversions, pleasures of the flesh, or should I think carefully about what's the fullest, most meaningful way to live? And I think that's what Poe is saying, basically, is don't be deluded into thinking that any sort of holiday from normalcy is an excuse not to continue to live a morally upright existence, or to live, another way of putting it that's less sort of moralistic or religiously framed would be to say, make sure you're living the fullest kind of life you can. And in the story, when you stop thinking, when you cut yourself off from sympathy, when you abandon any sense of duty to those less fortunate, you're really diminishing yourself. You're shutting down as a human being. And I think that the story is saying, do the opposite of that. Don't shut down. Open up, face life fully, face it directly, and don't live with the illusion that this is just a temporary state.
That is a striking line early in the story. It was folly to grieve or to think. This is from the point of view of Prospero and these lighthearted, hale, well, yes, as Catherine has already mentioned, we have some good questions coming in from our viewing audience. Again, send those in through the Q&A function in chat. We are with Paul Crumbly of Utah State University. We have a question from Patty Barnes, who refers to two possible references to earlier authors. One seems to be pretty explicit, to Victor Hugo's play, the Hermione. The possible one is to Duke Prospero in Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. So do you think he was referring to Shakespeare's character, Prospero? What's the reader supposed to make of that? And then what do you make of his more explicit reference to Victor Hugo's more recent play, The Hermione?
Well, okay, let me start with the Shakespeare. Yeah, I think Shakespeare's Prospero, the Duke of Milan, who was ousted by Antonio, he is on this island practicing magic. He's plotting revenge. And then he witnesses his daughter, and over time, he comes to accept a degree of humility and to change his desire for revenge, to think less solely about himself. He recognizes that he was a kind of self-absorbed leader and wasn't all that good when he was the Duke of Milan. And so he kind of converts almost to a new way of thinking about who he is and what his proper duties are as a leader of his people. And that involves a kind of humility and a sense of dedication to the wellness of others. And I think that also applies. I think that's what also Poe is saying is sort of missing, that Prince Prospero is sort of an anti-Duke Prospero from The Tempest.
Great.
That makes sense.
Great.
And the Hugo stuff, I don't know so much about that, but that gets at the perverseness that it surfaces, I think, in this story, that people who have decided to make survival primary, and you would think that they value life above all else, but they actually begin to degrade life, perhaps because they begin to detest their own mortality, because that's the one thing they try to deny at all costs. And out of that grows a degree of self-loathing or self-hatred that surfaces in these grotesque mockeries of the human form and of what the higher human aims or ambitions might be.
There's another biblical allusion we didn't reference in that when the revelers see this figure that seems a mummer, right? A mime, but dressed like from the grave. It's easy for us as the readers to see, oh my gosh, this is an apparition of death, or this is the spirit world or divine or something. But they just think it's somebody who has out-Heroded Herod. I mean, the sort of Christian view of King Herod the Great as lascivious and lustful and sensuous in the extreme. And so the revelers think, boy, this costume has really gone far. But Poe's saying actually they're blind to the reality of this spirit presence of judgment and of death. They have blinded themselves. Yeah.
And I do think that there is a sense in which there is a kind of reckoning here, and Prospero is incredibly arrogant. He's outraged, incensed that somebody would appear in a costume that he hadn't approved, and so in anger, he says they're going to hang this person from the battlements.
Yeah, he says it's a blasphemy, right? He says,
that's right.
He's some semi-divine figure, and this is a blasphemy against him.
Yeah.
So, Catherine, your turn to pose a question from our viewers.
Not sure that I have one, but I want to build on one of the questions which is if survival isn't the goal, is sympathy the only uniquely human characteristic? And maybe I would embroider with that question a little bit by observing that at the beginning of the story, when the Red Death is described, there's no cure for it. It attacks and kills you within a half hour. And I'm wondering so here's the political theorist coming out. If we look at Prospero as a ruler, which he is, he's called a prince and then a duke, what would be the more concrete policies that would express the sympathy? I mean, you know, what can he can't do anything. Or what could he do but retreat?
Well, there's a form of retreat that doesn't include an absence of sympathy. I think you can retreat in sorrow and in regret. I mean, he's postponed withdrawing until half of the people in his kingdom or his domain are dead. I think one of the things that's missing with Prospero is a sense of humility. There is a sense that he has the solution. The solution is to isolate. But if you really don't know what's happening, and that's the essence for humility, is to admit that you're afraid and that you don't know how to eliminate this problem that's a threat. And you need to keep your mind open, be responsive to what's going on around you. And I don't think to cut off all aid to the suffering humanity is a good idea either. I think it's possible to shelter in place, as we're trying to do at our moment in history. We're trying to shelter in place and protect ourselves in the face of a pandemic that we don't understand. We need leaders who are humble, are willing to admit their humility, their fear, and we need to provide for those, like the healthcare workers who are out there, and the grocery store clerks, and the people who are out there on the front lines. So you can, I guess what I'm trying to say is, you can isolate, but not alienate. And that alienation has to do with the withdrawal of affection, but also of fellow feeling for people.
Yeah, and that line in the story also is so stark. The external world could take care of itself. Just total disregard for. Another question from a viewer, Sharon Dunn, asks about your reference to Stowe, that she clearly had, Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin clearly had an audience in mind. I think the reader is suggesting, viewers suggesting a Christian audience. Yeah. What kind of audience do you think Poe intended or had in mind for this kind of story?
Well, I think Poe understood his audience, and he knew, I mean, at this moment, I mentioned the Second Great Awakening. In 1790, approximately 1 out of 20 Americans professed to have what was a practicing Christian, 1 in 20. But by 1840, 3 out of 4 Americans professed to be, and by this point, it was evangelical Protestant churches. So I think he was astute enough to understand that there was a big audience for this kind of literature. And he was witnessing the rise of the woman writer. And he was very closely affiliated with women writers, particularly in New York. And in many ways, his own writing took on many of the characteristics of the woman writer. and played into the domestic focus. I mean, in an odd way, even this particular tale is set in a kind of a domestic setting. And according to the values of the day, that should have been more like a cathedral, you know, where Christian values were promoted, along with the values associated with good citizenship. I think he was an astute assessor of his audience, and he was always struggling to get by. He was never a man who had an excess of income. Oh, and the other thing is that Stowe's audience, when she was writing primarily to women. And I think there's a way of reading this particular tale as if it were pitched to women as well. Maintaining Stowe's novel was a domestic novel, and according to, you know, to the values at that particular moment, a woman was supposed to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. And so Pope, those Christian values were spoken directly to women who were aspiring to those values.
Okay. Catherine, do you have a question from a viewer?
I don't think so. As
Okay.
a matter of fact, I was remiss, though, that the last question about sympathy, whether that was the only uniquely human characteristic, came from Elena Quint and Claire's Masque, who Elena Quint, at least I know, is a SCETL graduate.
Right. Good. Okay, I've got one from one of our faculty colleagues, Zach German. He asks about the way in which Poe depicts Prince Prospero bringing about his own death and the death of all the revelers by pursuing this figure of through the 7 rooms. So what do you think is the significance of that? And Zach asks whether that depiction leaves open a possibility that if Prospero had not become enraged, had not pursued this figure through the 7 rooms, that maybe he would have been spared an immediate death. The revelers might have been spared an immediate death. Do you see those implications in the story?
I don't think the story would have allowed him not to pursue, because the way that the Red Death violates the terms that Prospero established. But it's interesting, as I said before, I do think that he follows the Red Death in a state of rage. And so it's his arrogance and his refusal to allow his party to be disrupted, his absence of humility, his absence of fear that triggers his acceptance ultimately of the passage of time. But it's interesting at the end, the text describes him in the final black room, dropping his dagger. He raised his dagger, and then he drops it, and then he falls on his dagger, which is fascinating, because that could be an indication that he died accidentally or that he took his own life. And those possibilities lend themselves to various interpretations. Did he commit suicide? If he did commit suicide, is it because he recognized his folly and couldn't live with it, and in Christian terms gave way to despair in some sense? I think that's an interesting question. But I'm fascinated by the fact that Poe includes that information. He drops his dagger, then he falls on it. You know, there are critics who say that that's what killed him. It wasn't the Red Death.
Very interesting. Well, I'm going to sneak in one last question from a viewer. Again, this is Patty Barnes. Is Poe's emphasis on the revelry and no limits to it, so revelry unmasked?
Yeah.
Is that Poe's way of depicting these people as fearful, and this is their defense mechanism against fear of death and chaos and of the unknown. And if that is Poe's reading, what does it say about his view of human nature, how to respond to that, you know, possibility of just being engulfed by fear?
Yeah, I do think that that's there. I do think that the revelry is a kind of defense against the fear that's inherent in mortality. I think, you know, on the level of allegory, we all, in various ways, at various times in our lives, deny that we're mortal and conduct ourselves in ways that we consider outside the framework of normal life. And that is an expression of a kind of immortality, yearning for immortality. And Poe sees that as, I do think he sees that as a component of human life, but it's one that needs to be held in check. And this, he says it in this story. And it's also part of that sense of the perverse too, I think, is that because we're mortal, we understand that what we should do is live life as if death were present. But there's a part of us that, you know, in the end of the perverse in particular, he describes the impulse of perverse as is that feeling you get when you approach the edge of a precipice, and you know the one thing you don't want to do is go over the edge, but you feel this impulse to do exactly that. And so I think that dynamic is at work here in that attitude towards revelry. In some sense, it's exactly what you shouldn't do, but it's exactly what you do in order not to be contained by your mortality or confined by it.
And he has a very severe judgment as to
Yeah,
what happens.
right.
Yeah. Well, I regret to say we have come to the limit, speaking of limits and accepting limits, we have come to the limit of our